Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My hiking boots had covered nearly 14 miles that Friday in early September, and every muscle in my legs screamed for rest. The Chihuahuan Desert stretched endlessly around me, a brutal landscape of creosote bushes, ocotillo and rust-colored rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels frozen in time. Most of my college friends had settled into mortgages and minivan payments by now. But here I was, taking a solo trip through one of the most isolated stretches of wilderness in New Mexico, trying to figure out what came next after leaving my nursing job in Albuquerque. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, and I needed to find a spot to pitch my tent before darkness swallowed everything. I had been hiking off trail for most of the day, deliberately avoiding the more popular routes because I craved solitude. The foothills rose around me like crumbling staircases, dotted with boulders the size of small cars. When I spotted a cluster of sandstone formations creating a natural alcove, I felt a wave of relief wash through my exhausted body. It was perfect, sheltered from wind, invisible from any direction unless someone walked right up to it. I set up my small two-person tent behind the largest rock, positioning it so the opening faced the stone wall, rather than the open desert. Privacy felt important out here, even though I had not seen another human being since leaving the trailhead that morning. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that city people never truly experience, where you can hear your own heartbeat pulsing in your ears. I ate a cold dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, watching the stars emerge one by one until the entire sky transformed into a glittering canvas. My phone showed no signal, which I expected. I had downloaded offline maps before the trip and told my sister Valerie I would check in when I reached the next town in 3 days. By 9:30, I had crawled into my sleeping bag, bone-tired and oddly peaceful. The desert air cooled rapidly after sunset, and I zipped the tent closed, listening to the gentle rustle of wind against nylon. Sleep came quickly, pulling me under like a warm current, and for a few hours, everything was exactly as I had hoped it would be. The sound ripped me from sleep like a hand yanking me out of water. Engines, loud, aggressive, unmistakably the high-pitched whine of ATVs tearing through the desert floor. My eyes snapped open in the pitch blackness of my tent, and I lay completely still, my breath trapped somewhere in my chest. The noise grew louder, echoing off the rock formations, bouncing around until it seemed to come from every direction at once. I fumbled for my phone and checked the time, 11:47. For a long moment, I convinced myself it was just recreational riders, maybe some locals who knew the terrain and liked to race through the desert at night. But something about the way the engines revved, stopping and starting in irregular bursts, made my skin prickle with unease. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, moving inch by inch to avoid making any sound. The engines cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I crept to the mesh window of my tent and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the vague shapes of rocks and scrub brush under a sliver of moon. Then I noticed the lights, not headlights but handheld flashlights, 4 or 5 of them, bobbing about 300 yards to the east where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the beams sweep back and forth across the dirt. I could make out silhouettes now, maybe 4 or 5 figures moving with purpose, their movements coordinated like they had done this before. One of them carried something long across his shoulders, a rifle or a shotgun. I could not tell which from this distance. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay hidden, to not move, to barely breathe. I pressed myself lower against the tent floor, watching through the tiny window, as the figures gathered in a loose circle around a specific spot on the ground. Then I heard the sound of metal striking earth, rhythmic and deliberate, and I realized with dawning horror that they were digging. The digging continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. I did not dare move from my position, barely allowing myself to blink as I watched the flashlight beams dance across the basin. My legs cramped from holding still, but the fear running through my veins kept me anchored in place. Eventually the shoveling stopped, and I heard voices carry across the still night air. Low, masculine, too distant to make out specific words but close enough to catch the tone. They sounded casual, almost businesslike, like men discussing a routine task rather than whatever nightmare I was witnessing. Two of the figures broke away from the group and walked back toward where I assumed the ATVs were parked, disappearing behind a ridge. When they returned, they were dragging something between them, something large and heavy wrapped in what looked like a blue plastic tarp. The shape was unmistakable, even from 300 yards away. I had seen enough bodies during my years in the emergency room to recognize the proportions, the way the weight distributed, the limpness of limbs beneath synthetic material. They rolled the tarp into the pit with a carelessness that made bile rise in my throat. One of the men said something, and another laughed, a short barking sound that echoed off the rocks and reached me with sickening clarity. I watched as they began shoveling dirt back into the hole, working quickly now, their flashlights occasionally sweeping wider arcs across the terrain. Every time a beam swung in my general direction, I pressed my face into the tent floor and held my breath until spots danced behind my eyelids. My phone sat useless in my pocket, no signal bars mocking me with their absence. I thought about all the true crime podcasts I had listened to during long shifts, all the stories of people who stumbled onto something they should not have seen and paid the price. The desert was vast, empty, unforgiving. If something happened to me out here, Valerie would not even know to worry for another 3 days. By then I could be buried in my own shallow pit, just another mystery that the sand would eventually swallow. The men finished their work and gathered their tools. I watched one of them pour something from a jug over the freshly turned earth. Water maybe, or something to mask a scent from animals. They stood around for a few more minutes, smoking cigarettes whose orange tips glowed like tiny demons in the darkness. Then, one by one, they mounted their ATVs. The engines roared back to life, shattering the silence, and the headlights flicked on in a blinding burst. I buried my face in my arms as the beams swept across the desert floor, certain that at any moment they would land on my tent, and everything would be over. But the sound began to fade, moving away, heading south toward what I assumed was a road or a trail that connected to civilization. I waited until the noise dissolved completely into the night, until the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the frantic thudding of my pulse in my ears. Even then, I could not bring myself to move. I lay there in the darkness, trembling, replaying what I had seen over and over until the images burned themselves permanently into my brain. I must have stayed frozen in that position for at least an hour, maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness of that tent. Eventually, the rational part of my brain began to reassert itself, pushing through the fog of terror with practical thoughts. I needed to get out of here. I needed to move, to put as many miles as possible between myself and that shallow grave before sunrise. If I left now and hiked through the night, I could reach the highway by mid-morning and flag down a car. I could call the police, report what I saw, let them handle it. Slowly, carefully, I began gathering my things, shoving my sleeping bag into my pack with hands that refused to stop shaking. I did not want to turn on my headlamp. The darkness felt like the only protection I had left, so I worked by touch alone, fingers fumbling with zippers and straps. When I finally had everything packed, I crept to the tent door and unzipped it just enough to slip outside. That was when I saw it, and the air left my lungs like I had been punched in the chest. A tire track. Fresh, deep, pressed into the soft desert sand no more than 6 inches from the edge of my tent. The tread pattern was thick and aggressive, the kind you see on off-road vehicles, and it curved around the rock formation in a deliberate arc before disappearing back toward the basin. They had come here. While I was hiding inside, paralyzed with fear, one of them had driven right up to my campsite, close enough to reach out and touch the nylon walls. close enough to hear me breathing if I had made a single sound. I stared at that track in the pale moonlight, my mind refusing to process what it meant. They knew I was here. They had seen my tent, probably spotted it when their headlights swept across the rocks, and instead of confronting me, they had simply left. Why? The question gnawed at me as I stood there, exposed and vulnerable in the open air. Were they coming back? Were they watching me right now from somewhere in the darkness, waiting to see what I would do? The desert suddenly felt alive with invisible eyes, every shadow a potential threat, every whisper of wind a footstep creeping closer. I did not have time to think. I did not have the luxury of fear. I grabbed my pack and started moving, heading north, away from the burial site, away from the tire track, away from everything. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me across the uneven terrain while my eyes strained against the darkness. I could not use my headlamp. If they were watching, the light would make me an easy target. So I navigated by starlight alone, tripping over rocks and scrub brush, catching myself on my palms again and again. The skin on my hands tore open, but I barely felt it. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened, straining for the sound of engines or footsteps, but the desert remained silent. After what felt like hours, the eastern horizon began to lighten, shifting from black to deep purple to the first pale hints of orange. I had covered maybe 5 or 6 miles, pushing myself harder than I ever had in my life, and when I finally crested a ridge and saw a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the valley below, I nearly collapsed with relief. The highway, civilization, safety, or at least the illusion of it. A trucker named Wallace picked me up around 7 in the morning. He was an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes, hauling agricultural equipment down to Las Cruces, and he did not ask too many questions when I stumbled out of the scrubland looking like I had crawled through hell. He let me use his phone to call 911, and I sat in the cab of his rig shaking so hard that I could barely hold the device steady while I described what I had witnessed. The dispatcher transferred me to the county sheriff's department, and a deputy met us at a gas station about 30 miles down the road. I told him everything: the ATVs, the flashlights, the men with the tarp, the shallow pit, the tire track inches from my tent. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when I finished, he asked me if I could lead them back to the location. The thought of returning to that place made me want to vomit, but I nodded anyway. Whatever was buried in that desert, whoever it was, they deserved to be found. They deserved justice, or at the very least, a proper grave. It took most of that day to organize a search team and navigate back to the basin where I had watched the men dig. I rode in a sheriff's SUV with 2 deputies, following coordinates I had marked on my offline map, and the entire drive felt like descending back into a nightmare. When we arrived, the afternoon sun was blazing overhead, turning the desert into a furnace of heat and light. The deputies fanned out with shovels and a cadaver dog, and within 20 minutes, the dog alerted on a patch of disturbed earth exactly where I said it would be. They dug carefully, methodically, and when the first corner of blue tarp emerged from the sand, one of the deputies looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of validation and horror, like he had hoped I was wrong but knew I was not. They found a body. A woman, the medical examiner later determined, probably in her early 40s, dead less than 48 hours. The case remains open to this day. They never caught the men responsible, never identified the victim, never explained why they left me alive when they clearly knew I was there. I have thought about that question every single day for the past 2 years. Sometimes I convince myself they did not see me at all, that the tire track was just a coincidence, a random pass during their sweep of the area. Other times, in the darker hours of the night when sleep refuses to come, I believe they made a deliberate choice. That killing a witness would have complicated things, drawn more attention, created another body to bury. Maybe I was more useful to them alive, a traumatized hiker whose story would sound too wild to believe, who had no real evidence beyond her own terrified eyes. I moved back east after that trip, took a nursing job in Pennsylvania, where the landscape is green and the horizons are short. I do not hike alone anymore. I do not camp in places where I cannot see who is coming from every direction. The desert took something from me that night, some fundamental sense of safety that I will never get back. But it also gave me something, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive, smart enough to stay silent when silence was all that stood between me and a shallow grave. Whoever that woman was, I hope she has found peace. I hope someone, somewhere, is still looking for her. And I hope that the men who buried her in that basin are looking over their shoulders every single day, wondering if the witness they left alive will be the reason their world comes crashing down. After my divorce got finalized in April 2015, I made a decision that most people in my life thought was either brave or completely stupid. I quit my accounting job at a firm in Baltimore where I had spent 9 miserable years, sold most of my furniture, and decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail alone. My therapist called it running away from your problems with extra steps, which made me laugh for the first time in months. At 34, with no kids, no mortgage anymore, and a decent chunk of savings, I figured if there was ever a time to disappear into the woods for a few weeks, this was it. I had done some camping before, nothing too extreme, mostly weekend trips with college buddies back when we were young, and thought sleeping on rocks was fun. But solo backpacking through remote Appalachia was different. I knew that going in, or at least I thought I did. I had been on the trail for about 6 days when I reached a ridge that my map labeled as Creighton's Bluff, somewhere in the backcountry of Western Virginia. The spot was perfect for camping, a flat clearing about 30 feet from a steep drop-off that overlooked a valley thick with old-growth forest. No other hikers had passed me in almost 2 days, which was exactly what I wanted. Cell service had died sometime around day 3, and I had made peace with being completely disconnected. That Wednesday evening, I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked some dehydrated chili that tasted like cardboard mixed with regret. The sun dropped behind the mountains around 8, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that made me feel for a moment like maybe this whole trip was not such a crazy idea after all. I remember sitting there, watching the valley below fade into shadow, feeling genuinely calm for the first time since my ex-wife told me she had been seeing someone else. That calm would not last through the night. It started around 10:30, maybe 11. I was lying in my tent, not quite asleep, but drifting in that hazy space between awake and dreaming, when I heard the first rock, a sharp crack echoing up from the valley below, the unmistakable sound of stone hitting stone. I did not think much of it at first. Rocks fall, animals knock things loose, the mountains are alive with small noises at night. But then I heard another one, and another, and they were not random. There was a rhythm to them, a deliberate pattern, like someone was throwing rocks off a ledge at steady intervals. One every 8 or 10 seconds, each impact ringing through the darkness like a slow, patient drumbeat. I unzipped my tent and crawled out into the cold night air, my breath misting in front of my face. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see my own boots. I stood at the edge of the clearing and stared down into the valley. But there was nothing to see, just blackness, thick and absolute, swallowing everything below the ridgeline. The rocks kept falling. I counted them. 14, 15, 16, each one landing somewhere far below with that same sharp crack. It sounded like they were being thrown from somewhere to my left, maybe a quarter mile along the ridge, but I could not see any light or movement in that direction. No flashlight beam, no campfire glow, nothing to suggest another hiker was out there in the dark. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a bear knocking stones loose while foraging, or a rock slide that just happened to have a weirdly consistent pace. But I had spent enough time in the woods to know what natural sounds felt like. And this did not feel natural. This felt intentional, purposeful, like someone was sending a message across the darkness, and I just could not understand what it meant. After about 20 minutes, the rocks stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I climbed back into my tent, zipped it tight, and lay there with my eyes wide open, listening to my own heartbeat pound against the ground beneath me. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember is snapping awake to complete silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the forest itself is holding its breath. My watch said it was 1:47 in the morning. I lay still for a long moment, trying to figure out what had woken me, and then I saw it, a faint glow moving through the trees in the valley below. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe I was still half asleep and imagining things. But the light was real. It was dim and yellowish like an old lantern or a candle behind dirty glass, and it was weaving between the trees maybe half a mile down the slope. I grabbed my binoculars from my pack and pressed them to my face, trying to get a better look. The light bobbed and swayed as it moved, disappearing behind tree trunks and reappearing a few seconds later, heading in a direction that made no sense. There was no trail down there. I had studied my map carefully before setting up camp, and that part of the valley was unmarked wilderness, nothing but dense forest and rough terrain for miles. Then I saw another light. This one appeared further to the right, maybe 200 yards from the first, moving in a parallel path through the darkness. And then a third, even further out, barely visible through the canopy. 3 lights, all moving at roughly the same pace, all heading in the same general direction, like some kind of silent procession through the woods. I watched them for almost 15 minutes. My binoculars pressed so hard against my face that they left marks on my skin. The lights never flickered like flashlights would. They never swept back and forth like someone searching for a trail. They just drifted steadily forward, smooth and purposeful, weaving between obstacles I could not see. I tried to convince myself it was other hikers, maybe a group doing some kind of night trek, but nothing about the way those lights moved suggested normal hiking. Normal hikers stumble. Normal hikers stop to check their footing. These lights glided through the forest like they knew exactly where they were going, like they had walked that path 1,000 times before in the dark. Around 2:15, the lights changed direction, all 3 of them, almost simultaneously, like they had received some signal I could not hear. They stopped their forward movement and began angling upward toward the ridge, toward me. I lowered the binoculars and felt my chest tighten. It could have been a coincidence. The ridge was a natural landmark, and if those people were heading somewhere specific, following the high ground would make sense. But the timing felt wrong. They had been moving parallel to the ridge for 15 minutes, and now suddenly, they were climbing. I sat there in the darkness watching those 3 dim lights slowly ascend the slope, and I tried to calculate how long it would take them to reach the top. An hour maybe. Maybe less if they knew the terrain well. I thought about packing up and leaving, but hiking alone at night on a trail I barely knew seemed like a good way to twist an ankle or walk off a cliff. So I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that those lights were probably just locals out hunting or checking traps or doing whatever people did in these mountains after dark. I told myself a lot of things that night. None of them made me feel any better. By 3 in the morning, the lights had disappeared. I had lost sight of them about 40 minutes earlier, when they dropped below the tree line on their way up the slope. I kept expecting to see them emerge from the forest at the edge of my clearing, to hear voices or footsteps approaching through the brush. But nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. I sat with my back against a tree, facing the direction the lights had been coming from, my headlamp off and my knife in my hand. It was a folding blade, nothing impressive, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. The fire had gone completely cold by then, just a circle of gray ash that offered no warmth and no light. I thought about relighting it, but something told me not to. Something told me that right now, in this moment, being visible was not a good idea. So I sat in the dark and I waited, my ears straining for any sound that did not belong. The mountains around me felt different than they had during the day, older somehow, hostile, like I had wandered into a place where I was not supposed to be, and something out there knew it. I do not know when I fell asleep. I did not mean to. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stay alert, but exhaustion must have won eventually. One moment I was staring into the darkness with my knife clutched against my chest, and the next I was blinking awake to pale gray light filtering through the trees. Dawn. I had made it to dawn. My neck ached from sleeping upright against the tree, and my fingers were stiff from gripping the knife handle for hours. I sat there for a moment, letting the relief wash over me, listening to the first birds beginning to call in the canopy above. In the daylight, everything seemed almost normal again. The valley below was just a valley, green and quiet and unthreatening. The ridge was just a ridge. I let out a long breath and started to push myself up from the ground, already thinking about packing up my gear and putting as many miles as possible between me and this place. That is when I noticed the footprints. They were about 8 feet from where I had been sitting, pressed into the soft dirt near the remains of my campfire. I walked over slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The prints were bare feet. No boots, no shoes, just the clear impression of naked soles and toes pressed into the earth. They were wide, wider than my own feet by a good margin, and the toes were splayed apart in a way that looked almost unnatural, like whoever made them was used to walking without footwear. I crouched down and studied them, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were at least a dozen prints, overlapping in places, circling the dead fire in a slow, deliberate pattern. Whoever had made them had walked around my campsite while I slept. They had stood right there, right next to the ashes, close enough to touch my tent if they had reached out. I followed the tracks with my eyes, tracing their path around the fire pit, and felt something cold settle into my stomach when I saw where they led. The prints came right up to the base of the tree I had been leaning against. They stopped maybe 6 inches from where my legs had been stretched out in the dirt. Someone had stood over me in the darkness, barefoot and silent, watching me sleep, and I had not heard a thing. I packed my gear in under 5 minutes. I did not bother with breakfast, did not bother folding my tent properly, did not bother with any of the careful routines I had developed over the past week on the trail. I just shoved everything into my pack with shaking hands and started moving. The footprints led away from my campsite toward the eastern edge of the ridge, disappearing into a dense thicket of rhododendron that I had no intention of following. I went the opposite direction, back toward the main trail, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, scanning the trees around me for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet except for the birds and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. Too quiet, maybe. I kept thinking about those wide, splayed toes pressed into the earth, about how close they had been to my body while I slept. I kept thinking about the lights in the valley, moving in perfect coordination through the darkness. And I kept thinking about the rocks, that steady rhythm echoing across the mountains like a signal. A signal to whom? A signal for what? I did not want to know the answer. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked for nearly 7 hours straight, barely stopping except to drink water and check my map. By late afternoon, I had reached a small town called Bradshaw's Crossing. Nothing more than a gas station, a general store, and a cluster of old houses scattered along a 2-lane road. I must have looked like a wreck when I walked into that store. Dirty, exhausted, wild-eyed, because the old woman behind the counter took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I told her I had been camping up on Creighton's Bluff and had a rough night. She got quiet for a moment, her face doing something complicated that I could not quite read. Then she said, real casual, that most folks around here knew better than to camp up on that ridge. Said there were people who lived back in those hollows, families that had been there for generations, who did not take kindly to outsiders on what they considered their land. She did not say anything else, did not elaborate, just handed me my change and wished me safe travels with a look in her eyes that told me I was lucky to be standing there at all. I drove home the next day, sold my camping gear a week later, I have not been back to Appalachia since, and I do not plan to ever go again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythm in my head. Rock after rock after rock, falling into the darkness like a countdown to something I was never meant to see. My college roommate, Brianna, had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a celebration. All 5 of us had just survived our junior year finals, and we were desperate to decompress before summer internships scattered us across different states. The group was me, Brianna, our friend Chloe from the photography club, and 2 guys from our study group, Austin and Wesley. Brianna and I had shared a dorm since freshman year, which means I was 21 that spring. Still young enough to believe that bad things only happened to people who made bad decisions. I had known Austin since orientation week, and he had always been a little intense, but in a way that seemed harmless back then. He was the kind of guy who would text you 17 times if you did not respond within an hour, who remembered every detail of every conversation you ever had with him. Brianna used to joke that he would make someone a very attentive boyfriend someday. None of us were laughing by the end of that weekend. We drove up to Blackwood Ridge in Austin's pickup truck on a Friday afternoon. The campsite was about 4 hours from campus, deep in a national forest that Brianna had discovered through some hiking forum online. She had printed out maps, packed enough supplies for a week even though we were only staying 2 nights, and created a whole itinerary of trails and lookout points she wanted us to visit. The drive up was normal enough. We played music, passed around bags of chips and gummy worms, talked about professors we hated and classes we were dreading in the fall. Austin was quieter than usual, spending most of the ride staring out the window at the passing trees. I figured he was just exhausted from finals like the rest of us. When we finally pulled off the main road onto the dirt path leading to our campsite, the sun was already starting to dip below the tree line. The forest closed around us like a fist, branches scraping against the windows as if trying to get in. I remember thinking how isolated we were, how far from everything. At the time, it felt like freedom. We set up camp in a clearing about half a mile from where we parked. Wesley and Brianna handled the tents while Chloe gathered kindling for the fire pit. Austin immediately started giving directions, even though nobody had asked him to be in charge. He told Wesley the tent stakes were going in at the wrong angle. He told Brianna the rain fly was inside out. He walked over to where Chloe was collecting sticks and started sorting through her pile, tossing aside the ones he deemed too damp or too thin. I watched him from across the clearing, and something about the way he moved struck me as odd. There was a nervous energy to him, a tightness in his shoulders that had not been there during the drive. When I asked if he was okay, he turned to me with this strange look, not angry, not sad, just empty somehow, and said he was fine. Then he smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Brianna caught my gaze and shrugged, mouthing the word finals, as if that explained everything. I wanted to believe her. That first night around the campfire should have been perfect. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than I had ever seen living in the city, and Chloe had brought her portable speaker so we could listen to music while we roasted marshmallows. But Austin kept steering the conversation in uncomfortable directions. He brought up a party from sophomore year where Brianna had gotten too drunk and needed someone to walk her home. He had been that someone, and he made sure we all remembered it. He mentioned the time he had helped Chloe edit her photography portfolio at 2 a.m. before a submission deadline. He talked about lending Wesley money for textbooks, about driving me to the pharmacy when I had the flu last winter. Every story was technically true, but the way he told them made it sound like we all owed him something. Wesley tried to change the subject a few times, but Austin kept circling back. By the time we crawled into our tents around midnight, the mood had shifted. The easy laughter from the car ride felt like it belonged to a different trip entirely. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of arguing. The sun was barely up, pale light filtering through the tent fabric, and I could hear Austin's voice outside, low and insistent. I unzipped the flap just enough to see him standing with Chloe near the edge of the clearing. She had her arms crossed tight against her chest. and even from 20 feet away I could tell she was upset. Austin was leaning toward her, one hand gesturing toward the woods, the other gripping her elbow. When Chloe tried to pull away, he held on for just a second too long before letting go. She walked back toward the tents without looking at him, her face pale. I pretended to be asleep when she climbed back into the tent she shared with Brianna. Later, when I asked what happened, Chloe said Austin had wanted her to go on an early morning hike with him, just the two of them. When she said no, he had gotten weird about it. She used that exact word, weird. Not angry, not aggressive, just weird. Like he could not understand why she would possibly refuse. Like the concept of someone saying no to him did not compute. Brianna suggested we all stick together for the rest of the trip, and we agreed. But Austin acted like nothing had happened. The rest of the morning, Austin kept finding reasons to separate us. He asked Wesley to help him gather firewood on the opposite side of the camp, then spent 40 minutes walking him deeper and deeper into the trees until Wesley finally insisted they head back. He told Brianna there was an amazing view just 10 minutes down a trail, and when she said she would rather wait for the group, he sulked for an hour. He kept appearing beside me whenever I wandered even a few feet from the others, materializing silently like he had been watching and waiting for the moment I was alone. Each time he would say something casual. "Nice morning. Did you sleep okay? Want to check out that stream I found?" But his eyes tracked my movements with an intensity that made my skin prickle. By noon, we had all noticed the pattern. Wesley pulled me aside while Austin was in his tent and whispered that something was seriously wrong. He said Austin had been talking during their firewood walk about how none of us appreciated him, how he did everything for this group and got nothing in return. Wesley's hands were trembling when he told me. He wanted to leave. We all did. But Austin had the only car, and he had the keys in his pocket. We tried to act normal for the rest of the afternoon, but the tension was suffocating. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. Austin would join in, say something that seemed friendly enough on the surface, and then add a little comment that landed like a slap. When Brianna mentioned she was excited about her summer internship in Boston, Austin said it was funny how she always managed to land on her feet, unlike some people who actually had to work for things. When Chloe took photos of the creek, Austin asked if she ever got tired of hiding behind a camera instead of actually connecting with people. Each remark was delivered with a smile, in a tone that made you question whether you had heard it right. Brianna kept shooting me glances that screamed, "We need to talk," but there was never a moment when Austin was not hovering nearby. Around 4 in the afternoon, Chloe announced she was going to take a nap in her tent. Brianna said she would join her. Wesley suddenly remembered he had a headache and retreated to the tent he shared with Austin. I started to follow Brianna, desperate to regroup and figure out a plan, but Austin stepped directly into my path. He told me he needed to talk to me about something important. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made every instinct in my body scream to run. I said I was tired too, that we could talk later, but he shook his head slowly. He said this could not wait. He said he had found something in the woods earlier that morning, something bad. A hiker, he said, about a mile down the eastern trail. She had fallen and hurt her leg, could not walk, and was alone out there with no cell service and no way to get help. He said he had been waiting all day to tell someone, but did not want to scare the group. He said the woman was in real pain and we needed to help her right now. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and he reached out to take my hand. He said the others would slow us down, that we needed to move fast, just the two of us. Something about the way he said it, just the two of us, made my heart start pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told him we should get Wesley. Austin's face flickered. Just for a fraction of a second, something dark passed behind his eyes before the mask slipped back into place. He said Wesley would only slow us down, that the woman needed help now and we were wasting precious time. I told him we should at least tell Brianna where we were going in case something happened. Austin's grip on my hand tightened, and he said there was no time, that every second we stood here arguing was a second that poor woman was suffering alone in the woods. His voice cracked on the word suffering, like he was genuinely upset, and for a moment I almost believed him. Almost. But then I remembered something. That morning, when I had woken up to Austin and Chloe arguing, the sun had barely risen. Austin claimed he found this injured hiker during an early morning walk, but he had been with Chloe at dawn, trying to convince her to go hiking with him. He had not gone anywhere alone. There was no injured hiker. There never had been. The realization hit me like ice water, and I yanked my hand away from his so hard I stumbled backward. I said I needed to use the bathroom first. I said I would be right back, just give me 2 minutes and then we could go. Austin stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wanted to spit out. I kept my face blank, kept my voice steady, even though every nerve in my body was on fire. Finally, he nodded. He said he would wait right here, that I should hurry. I walked toward the tree line as calmly as I could manage, feeling his eyes burning into my back with every step. The moment I was out of his direct line of sight, I ran. I ran straight to Brianna's tent and threw open the flap, not caring about being quiet anymore. Brianna and Chloe both sat up, startled, and I told them everything in a frantic whisper. The injured hiker that did not exist. The way Austin had been trying to get me alone. The lie that unraveled the second I thought about the timeline. Chloe's face went white. Brianna grabbed my arm and pulled me inside the tent, zipping it shut behind me. Through the thin fabric walls, we could hear Austin calling my name. His voice was still calm, still friendly. That was somehow the worst part. Wesley heard the commotion and crawled out of his tent, asking what was going on. Austin intercepted him before he could reach us, and through the tent fabric I could hear Austin explaining that I had gotten upset over nothing, that I was being dramatic, that he was just trying to help someone in need and I had freaked out for no reason. His voice was so reasonable, so measured, that for a split second I wondered if I had made a mistake. But then Brianna squeezed my hand and whispered that we needed to get those keys. Chloe had her phone out, desperately searching for a signal, even though we all knew there was none this deep in the forest. We heard Wesley's voice rise. He was arguing with Austin, demanding to know what was really going on. Then there was a scuffle, the sound of someone hitting the ground, and Wesley shouted for us to run. Brianna unzipped the back of the tent, the side facing away from the campsite, and the three of us crawled out into the underbrush. We ran toward the trail that led back to the parking area, branches whipping our faces and arms, not daring to look back. I could hear Austin crashing through the woods behind us, calling our names in that same calm voice, telling us we were overreacting, telling us to stop and just talk to him. We made it to the dirt road where the truck was parked, but without the keys we could not drive. Brianna remembered passing a ranger station about 2 miles back on the main road, and we started running again. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they might give out. But I did not stop. None of us did. We reached the ranger station just as the sun was starting to set, and the woman behind the desk took one look at our faces and immediately picked up her radio. 2 rangers drove us back to the campsite in their vehicle. When we got there, Austin was sitting calmly by the fire pit, roasting a marshmallow like nothing had happened. Wesley was in his tent with a bloody nose and a bruise forming under his left eye. Austin tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that we had panicked over a joke, but the rangers were not buying it. They escorted us to our cars. One ranger drove Austin's truck with Austin in the passenger seat, while the other followed with the rest of us. We filed a report at the local police station that night. Austin was not arrested, but there was a record now, a paper trail. We never spoke to him again after that weekend. I heard through mutual friends that he transferred schools the following semester. Sometimes I still think about that moment in the clearing, when he took my hand and asked me to follow him into the woods. I think about what might have happened if I had not remembered that he was with Chloe that morning. If I had believed him, if I had gone. Camping alone seemed like a good idea when I planned it back in January. My sister had just gotten married. Most of my college buddies were having their second or third kids, And here I was, same apartment since graduation in 2012, same job at the warehouse, same routine that felt more like a slow death than a life. I needed something that would remind me I was still breathing, still capable of doing things on my own terms. So I picked a spot in the Ozarks, about 4 hours from my place in Kansas City. Deep enough into the woods that cell service became a distant memory. The campsite was technically off the grid. No designated spots, no rangers checking in, just me and whatever wildlife decided to tolerate my presence. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in early October, the kind of day where the leaves were turning burnt orange and the air had that crisp bite that makes you feel genuinely alive. I set up my tent about 30 yards from an old logging road that looked like it had not seen regular traffic in years, maybe decades. Overgrown with weeds, rutted with erosion, it seemed like the perfect backdrop for the solitude I was craving. That first day went exactly how I had imagined it would. I spent the afternoon hiking a trail I found on an old forestry map. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to work up a sweat and clear my head. The forest was dense with oak and hickory, and every now and then I would catch a glimpse of deer watching me from between the trees before bounding off into the underbrush. I cooked dinner over a small fire as the sun went down. Just canned chili and some bread I had packed. Nothing fancy, but it tasted incredible out there in the middle of nowhere. By 9 that evening, I was in my tent with a paperback I had been meaning to read for months, a flashlight propped against my backpack, and the sounds of the forest settling in around me. Owls hooting somewhere in the distance, branches creaking in the wind, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the fallen leaves. I fell asleep around 10, feeling more at peace than I had in months, completely unaware that in a few hours, that peace would shatter into something I still have nightmares about. The sound that woke me was not loud, but it was wrong. Out here, you get used to the natural rhythm of the forest pretty quick. Animals moving through brush, wind pushing through branches, the occasional crack of a dead limb falling somewhere in the darkness. But this was different. This was mechanical. A low rumble that grew steadily louder, the unmistakable groan of engines working hard against rough terrain. I lay there in my sleeping bag, eyes open, heart starting to pick up speed, telling myself it was probably just some hunters using the old logging road as a shortcut. People did that sometimes, right? Used abandoned roads to get deeper into hunting grounds. But something in my gut was telling me to stay quiet, stay still. Do not move until you know what you are dealing with. Checked my phone out of habit. 3:14 in the morning, no signal, battery at 62%. The engine noise grew louder and then multiplied. Not one vehicle, 2. I heard them stop maybe 50 yards from my position, engines idling for a moment before cutting off completely. Doors opened and closed, not slammed but pushed shut carefully, deliberately, the way someone closes a door when they do not want to make noise. I could hear voices now, low and indistinct, the kind of murmuring that happens when people are trying not to be heard. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay exactly where I was, but I needed to see what was happening. I unzipped my sleeping bag as slowly as humanly possible, each tooth of the zipper sounding like a gunshot in the silence of my tent. I crawled toward the mesh window on the side facing the road, keeping my body as flat as I could against the ground. The moon was about 3/4 full that night, bright enough to cast shadows, and when I pressed my face against the mesh, I could see them, 2 pickup trucks, both dark-colored, parked nose to nose on the logging road. And around them, moving with purpose, at least 5 men. They were unloading something from the bed of the first truck, rectangular bundles wrapped tight in what looked like black plastic or maybe heavy-duty trash bags, each one about the size of a large duffel bag. The men worked in near silence, passing the bundles from one to another in a chain, stacking them on the ground between the 2 vehicles. I counted the packages as they moved them, 8, 9, 10, 12 total. One of the men said something I could not make out, and another one responded with a harsh whisper that carried just enough for me to catch the tone. Angry, impatient. These were not hunters, these were not hikers who got lost. I had stumbled into something I was never supposed to see, and the realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I pressed myself even flatter against the floor of my tent, trying to make myself as small as possible, barely breathing. The arguing got louder. I could make out fragments now, something about a count being wrong, about someone named Ray who had screwed something up. One of the men, taller than the others with broad shoulders and a baseball cap, stepped away from the group and pulled out a flashlight. He clicked it on and swept the beam across the tree line, slow and deliberate, like he was looking for something specific. The light passed within 10 feet of my tent, and I swear my heart stopped beating for a full second. Then the beam swung back toward the road, and the tall man froze. He was staring at the ground near the edge of the logging road, right where the overgrown grass met the dirt. I knew instantly what he was looking at. My boot prints. The ones I had left that afternoon when I crossed the road during my hike. The ones I had not even thought twice about, because who would ever see them out here in the middle of nowhere? The tall man called out to the others, his voice low but urgent. I watched as 3 of them gathered around him, flashlights clicking on one by one. All of them aimed at the ground where my tracks disappeared into the tree line, toward me. One of them pulled something from his waistband, a handgun, black and angular in the moonlight, and held it down by his side. Another one had what looked like a shotgun, the barrel catching the light as he shifted it from one hand to the other. They talked among themselves for maybe 30 seconds, their voices too quiet for me to make out the words. But their body language told me everything I needed to know. They were going to search, they were going to find me. I had maybe 2 minutes, maybe less, before one of those flashlight beams landed on my green 2-person tent, and everything I had ever worried about in my life became completely irrelevant. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it fast. Running was not an option. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves and fallen branches, and I would sound like a stampeding elephant the moment I tried to move. Staying in the tent was suicide. They would find it. They would find me inside it, and whatever happened after that would not end with them politely asking me to forget what I saw. My eyes landed on a fallen oak about 15 feet from my tent, a massive trunk that had come down sometime in the last year, its root system torn up and creating a dark, hollow space beneath where it had lifted the earth. I had noticed it when I was setting up camp, thought about how it would make decent shelter if my tent failed. Now it might be the only thing that kept me alive. I grabbed my phone and my knife, the only things within reach that mattered, and I started crawling toward the back of my tent, toward the zipper that faced away from the road. Every inch felt like a mile. Every rustle of my clothing against the tent floor sounded like a scream. I got the back zipper open just enough to squeeze through, and I slithered out onto the cold ground like some kind of desperate animal. The fallen oak was right there, a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest. I could hear the men entering the tree line now, maybe 40 feet behind me, their footsteps crunching through the leaves with no attempt at stealth. They were not trying to be quiet anymore. They knew someone was out here and they were coming to find them. I crawled on my belly toward the root hollow, feeling rocks and twigs dig into my chest and stomach, biting down on my lips so hard I tasted copper. The hollow was smaller than I remembered, barely big enough for a grown man to fit inside, but I wedged myself into it anyway. I pulled dead leaves over my legs, pressed my face into the dirt, and I waited. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood filled my nostrils. Somewhere above me an owl took flight, its wings cutting through the air with a sound like shuffled paper. The flashlight beams found my tent about 30 seconds later. I heard one of them curse, a sharp, surprised sound that cut through the quiet, and then they were all talking at once, their voices overlapping in urgent bursts. Someone said, "Check inside," and I heard the unmistakable sound of my tent being ripped open, the fabric tearing like it was made of tissue paper. They were maybe 20 feet from where I lay hidden, close enough that I could hear them breathing, close enough that if one of them decided to sweep that flashlight beam just a little to the left, just a little lower, they would see me. I pressed myself deeper into the hollow, feeling the roots dig into my back, feeling something crawl across my hand that I refused to think about. One of the men was going through my belongings now, I could hear him tossing things aside, my backpack hitting the ground, my sleeping bag being shaken out. Then a voice, clearer than the others, said something that made me dig my fingernails into the dirt. Whoever was here left in a hurry. They could still be close, spread out. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my entire life. I lay there in that hollow, not moving, barely breathing, while flashlight beams swept through the trees around me. At one point, a pair of boots stopped less than 5 feet from my hiding spot. I could see them through a gap in the roots, brown work boots caked with mud, standing right there on the other side of the fallen trunk. The man was breathing hard, annoyed, muttering something under his breath about wasting time. I watched those boots pivot slowly, the flashlight beam passing directly over the trunk above my head, and I made a deal with whatever God might be listening. If I survived this night, I would never take another moment of my ordinary, boring life for granted. The boots turned and walked away, crunching through the leaves toward the road, and I finally let myself take a full breath. But I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stayed exactly where I was, buried in the dirt like a corpse, waiting. Eventually, I heard them gathering back by the trucks. The tall man was giving orders, his voice carrying through the still night air. They were going to finish what they came here to do and get out. If whoever was camping here had run off into the woods, they were probably miles away by now, not worth chasing in the dark. I heard the bundles being loaded into the second truck, heard doors slamming shut with less care than before, heard engines starting up and tires grinding against the rutted road. The sound of those trucks fading into the distance was the sweetest thing I had ever heard, but still I did not move. I lay in that hollow for another hour, maybe 2, until the first gray light of dawn started filtering through the trees. Only then did I crawl out, covered in dirt and dead leaves and something sticky I did not want to identify. My tent was destroyed. My backpack had been dumped out and scattered, but I was alive. I was alive and they were gone, and none of it felt real. I gathered what I could salvage and hiked out of those woods faster than I have ever moved in my life. It took me almost 3 hours to reach my car, parked at a trailhead off the main highway, and another 40 minutes of driving before my phone finally picked up a signal. I pulled over at the first gas station I saw and called the police. The deputy who took my statement was a woman named Torres, mid-50s with tired eyes and a voice that suggested she had heard a lot of strange stories over the years. She listened without interrupting, wrote everything down and told me she would pass it along to the county sheriff and the DEA field office. She also told me, in that careful way cops have when they are trying not to scare you, that I should probably stay with family for a while, just in case. I did not ask her to explain what she meant by that. I did not need her to. I drove straight to my sister's place in Springfield and did not go back to my apartment for 2 weeks. I never heard anything official about what happened that night. No arrests made the news, no drug busts in the Ozarks that matched what I saw. Torres called me once, about a month later, to tell me the investigation was ongoing but that I should not expect any updates. She thanked me for coming forward and reminded me again to be careful. That was it. Sometimes I wonder if those men ever figured out who I was, if they went back to that campsite and found something I left behind, some piece of identification I did not think to grab in my panic. Sometimes I lie awake at night and imagine a dark pickup truck parked outside my building, engine idling, waiting. But it has been almost 2 years now, and nothing has happened. I still go camping, not alone anymore and never anywhere remote. I stick to established campgrounds with rangers and other families and cell service. I traded solitude for safety, and I have made my peace with that. But every now and then, when I am lying in my tent and I hear an engine in the distance, my whole body goes rigid, and I am right back in that hollow, pressing my face into the dirt, praying those boots do not come any closer. Most of my coworkers thought solo backpacking was reckless for a woman, and they never missed a chance to remind me. But by the spring of 2014, I had stopped caring what anyone thought. My marriage had crumbled 6 months earlier, My friends from nursing school were all wrapped up in toddlers and PTA meetings. And somewhere around my 34th birthday, I realized that the loneliness I felt in crowded rooms was worse than any solitude the wilderness could offer. Oregon became my refuge, the Cascade Range specifically, where the Douglas firs grow so thick they block out the sky, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I had planned this particular trip for weeks, a 4-day solo trek into a section of backcountry that most day hikers never reached. My younger sister Megan called me the night before I left, her voice tight with worry, listing every news story she could find about women who vanished on trails. I promised her I would check in at every trailhead, that I had my satellite beacon, that I knew what I was doing. She did not sound convinced. The first 2 days unfolded like a meditation. I covered about 14 miles each day, my boots finding rhythm on the packed earth, stopping only to filter water from streams so clear you could count every pebble on the bottom. The burn in my calves and shoulders felt earned, purposeful, nothing like the hollow exhaustion of crying myself to sleep in an empty apartment. By the third evening, I had pushed deep into the backcountry, reaching a small clearing roughly 7 miles from the nearest marked trailhead. I found the spot through a backpacking form, one of those hidden gems that experienced hikers whisper about, but never post coordinates for. It was perfect. Level ground for my tent, a creek babbling maybe 30 feet away, surrounded by forest so dense it felt like a fortress. I made camp while the light was still golden, hung my food bag from a high branch, and crawled into my sleeping bag with that particular peace that only comes from physical exhaustion and total isolation. I remember zipping the tent closed and thinking, finally, I can breathe. I woke to darkness and the sound of the zipper. Not a fast sound, not the careless tug of wind against fabric. This was slow, deliberate, a centimeter at a time, the metal teeth separating with a soft purr that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. My eyes snapped open and I lay there, every muscle locked, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. The zipper stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of clothing. Nothing. Just the creak in the distance and the blood pounding in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon investigating the tent, maybe the fabric had settled in the cooling night air. But I had camped dozens of times, and I knew what wind sounded like against nylon. This was not wind. This was someone testing how quietly the zipper could be opened, someone checking whether I would wake. I do not know how long I lay there. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Time becomes strange when your body floods with adrenaline, and your brain is screaming at you to move, but your limbs refuse to cooperate. I thought about the pepper spray in the side pocket of my pack, about the small knife I kept clipped to my belt, about the satellite beacon that was supposed to be my lifeline. All of it was useless if I could not make myself move. When the zipper sound did not return, I forced myself to sit up, my sleeping bag rustling so loudly it made me wince. I grabbed my headlamp from the mesh pocket near my head and held it like a weapon, my thumb hovering over the power button. I counted to 10, then to 20, giving whoever, whatever, was outside time to leave. Then I took the deepest breath of my life, unzipped the tent flap in one fast motion, and burst out into the night with the headlamp blazing. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness and found only trees, their trunks pale and ghostly in the white light. I spun in a circle, my heart slamming against my ribs, searching for movement, for the shape of a person, for anything that would confirm I was not losing my mind. The clearing was empty. The forest stood silent and indifferent around me, the creek still murmuring its endless song somewhere to my left. I stood there in my thermal underwear and wool socks, the cold mountain air biting at my exposed skin, and I almost laughed. Almost convinced myself that I had dreamed the whole thing, that the stress of the past months had finally cracked something loose in my brain. Then I turned back toward my tent and saw my hiking poles. I had planted them in the ground beside the tent vestibule before bed, crossed in an X the way I always did, so I could find them easily in the morning. Now they were lying flat on the ground, parallel to each other, positioned almost neatly about 3 feet from where I had left them. The air left my lungs like I had been punched. I swept the headlamp beam across my campsite, forcing myself to really look at everything. My backpack was leaning against a tree where I had left it, but the main compartment buckles were undone. I always fastened them. It was habit, muscle memory from years of keeping my gear secure. I walked toward it on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. And when I got close, I could see that the top flap had been lifted, the contents slightly rearranged. My first aid kit was on top now, though I distinctly remembered packing it beneath my rain jacket. Someone had been going through my things while I slept, and they had been quiet enough that I only woke when they started on the tent. The thought made my throat close up. How long had they been there? How close had they gotten before I heard the zipper? I backed away from the pack, my headlamp swinging wildly as I scanned the tree line, suddenly certain that whoever had done this was still watching me from somewhere in that wall of darkness. I do not know what made me look down. Maybe instinct, maybe some part of my brain that understood what I needed to see before the rest of me caught up. But I angled my headlamp toward the ground around my tent, and that is when I saw the boot prints. They were clear in the soft earth, pressed deep by someone heavier than me, the treads thick and wide. A man's hiking boot, size 11 or 12 at least. The prints circled my tent in a complete loop, then circled again, 2 full rotations around the place where I'd been sleeping. I followed them with the beam of my light, my breath coming in shallow gasps, tracing the path this person had walked while I lay unconscious just a few feet away. The prints did not approach the tent from the trail. They came from deeper in the forest, from a direction where there was no path, no reason for anyone to be walking. Whoever this was had not stumbled upon my camp by accident. They had come through the woods deliberately, found me in a spot that was not on any map, and circled my tent like a predator studying its prey. The boot prints stopped at the back of the tent. Not the entrance, not the vestibule, the back, directly behind where my head had been resting on my folded jacket. I stared at those prints, at the deep impression in the soil where someone had stood perfectly still, and I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. This person had walked twice around my tent, then positioned themselves inches from my skull, with only a thin layer of nylon between us. They had stood there listening to me breathe, maybe watching my silhouette through the fabric, close enough to touch me if they wanted. The realization hit me in waves, first disbelief, then horror, then a cold and primal fear that made every hair on my body stand rigid. I was 7 miles from the trailhead, no cell service, no other campers. Just me and whoever was out there in the dark. Someone patient enough to circle my tent twice and careful enough to test my zipper 1 millimeter at a time. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run. Just grab the beacon, hit the SOS button, and start moving toward the trailhead as fast as my legs could carry me. But 7 miles in the dark, on uneven terrain, with someone potentially following me, that was a death sentence of a different kind. Could twist an ankle in the first mile, could lose the trail entirely without daylight to guide me, could walk straight into whoever was waiting out there. So I made myself think. I grabbed my pepper spray from my pack and shoved it into my waistband. I found my knife and clutched it in my right hand. I pulled on my boots without bothering to lace them and dragged everything I could carry into the tent. My pack, my poles, even the rocks I used to stake down the corners. Then I zipped myself inside and sat with my back against the pack, facing the entrance. My headlamp pointed at the zipper like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I did not turn off the light. I did not close my eyes. I sat there for hours, listening to every sound the forest made, waiting for the zipper to start moving again. Dawn came slowly, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to gray in increments so gradual I almost did not notice. When enough light filtered through the nylon that I could see color again, I allowed myself one long exhale. I had not heard anything else during the night, no footsteps, no rustling, no second attempt at the zipper. But I was not foolish enough to think that meant I was safe. I packed my gear in record time, my hands fumbling with buckles and straps, shoving everything into my bag without the careful organization I normally insisted on. The boot prints were still there in the morning light, even clearer now, and I forced myself to photograph them with my phone before I left. I do not know why. Evidence, maybe, or proof to myself that I had not imagined the whole thing. The photos showed exactly what I had seen in the dark, 2 complete circles around the tent, deep impressions where someone had stood motionless at my head, and a single line of tracks leading back into the forest in the direction of nothing. I hiked out faster than I have ever moved in my life. What should have taken 4 hours took me just under 3, my legs burning, my lungs screaming, but I refused to stop for more than a few seconds at a time. Every snapping branch made me spin around. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure waiting. I kept the pepper spray in my hand the entire way, my thumb on the trigger, ready for someone to step out of the forest and confirm my worst fears. But no one did. The trail remained empty, the woods remained silent, and when I finally reached the trailhead parking lot and saw my car sitting there untouched, I nearly collapsed against the hood. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, a green pickup truck with Montana plates and a white sedan with a bike rack on top. I stared at them for a long moment, wondering if one of them belonged to whoever had visited my camp, wondering if they were still out there in the wilderness or if they had already driven away before dawn. I got in my car, locked the doors, and did not stop driving until I reached the ranger station 20 miles down the mountain. The ranger on duty was a woman named Colleen, mid-50s with gray streaks in her braid, and the kind of calm demeanor that made me feel safe for the first time in 12 hours. I showed her the photos, told her everything, the zipper, the boot prints, the way my things had been moved. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she told me I was not the first. There had been 2 other reports that summer, both from solo female hikers in the same general area, both describing similar experiences. Someone approaching their camp at night, testing tent zippers, moving equipment. One woman had woken to find her boots placed neatly outside her tent door, laces removed. Another discovered a small pile of rocks stacked beside her head, placed there while she slept. Colleen said they had increased patrols but never caught anyone, never found a permanent camp or any other evidence. She took down my information, filed a report, and told me to contact local law enforcement if I wanted to press further. I drove home that afternoon and did not go back to the Cascades for 2 years. I still hike. I refuse to let whoever that was take that away from me, but I never camp alone anymore, and I never will again. Sometimes at night, when I am lying in bed in my apartment with the doors locked and the city humming outside my window, I think about those boot prints circling my tent. I think about the patience it took to move that slowly, that quietly, to test a zipper 1 tooth at a time while a woman slept inches away. I think about what would have happened if I had not woken up, if the sound had not pulled me from sleep at exactly the right moment. The ranger told me they never caught anyone, and as far as I know, they still have not. I check the hiking forums sometimes, looking for new reports from that area, hoping I will read that someone was arrested, that the mystery was solved. But there is never any update, never any resolution. Just silence, and the knowledge that somewhere in those mountains someone is still out there, walking through the trees in the dark, circling tents, testing zippers, waiting for the ones who do not wake up. Nathan turned 26 on a Friday in early June, and since he had been talking about doing something different for months, our group decided to skip the usual bar crawl and rent a campsite at Pine Ridge Lake instead. The place was about 3 hours north of where we all lived in Ohio, tucked away in this sprawling state park that promised seclusion and good fishing. There were 5 of us making the trip: Nathan, his girlfriend Jenna, our friend Troy and his younger brother Danny, and me. We had all graduated from the same high school back in 2016, except for Danny, who was a few years behind us, and camping together felt like the kind of throwback adventure we needed, after years of desk jobs and routine weekends. I remember packing that morning with this genuine excitement I had not felt in a long time, thinking about campfires and cold beers and staying up late telling stupid stories. The drive up was perfect, all green hills and that particular early summer light that makes everything look like a postcard. None of us could have known what was waiting for us at that lake. We pulled into the campground around 4 in the afternoon, and the ranger at the entrance booth was this older guy with a sun-weathered face who handed us a paper map and pointed us toward site number 17. The campground was laid out in a big loop around the lake, with maybe 30 sites total, but ours was at the far end where the loop curved back into thicker woods. I noticed immediately how isolated it felt. Site 16 to our left was completely empty, just a fire pit and a wooden post with the number on it, and beyond that the trees grew dense and dark. The ranger mentioned that weekday bookings were slow this time of year, and that we might have this whole section to ourselves. Nathan loved that idea, said it meant we could be as loud as we wanted without bothering anyone. We spent the next 2 hours setting up our tents, gathering firewood from the designated area, and hauling our coolers down to the site. Jenna had made this elaborate birthday cake that somehow survived the drive in a special container, and we stuck candles in it right there on the picnic table while the sun started dropping behind the tree line. By the time we got the fire going and cracked open the first round of beers, the sky was turning that deep orange color that only exists in places far away from city lights. Everything felt exactly right. The night came on fast and thick, the way it does when you are miles from any real town. We sat around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey Nathan had brought, trading old stories and giving him grief about getting older. Danny had this portable speaker playing classic rock at a reasonable volume, and Jenna was roasting marshmallows with this very specific technique she kept insisting was the only correct way. Around 11, Troy mentioned he needed to grab something from the car, and when he came back he had this weird look on his face. He said he thought he saw a light moving through the trees near Site 16, like a flashlight beam sweeping low to the ground. We all looked over but saw nothing except darkness and the vague shapes of branches. Nathan figured it was probably the ranger doing a late patrol or maybe some animal reflecting our fire. We laughed it off, but I noticed Troy kept glancing in that direction for the next 20 minutes. The woods beyond our little circle of firelight seemed to press in closer than before, and the spaces between the trees looked deeper somehow, like they went on forever into nothing. Around midnight we heard the laughter for the first time. It came from the direction of Site 16, this burst of sound that seemed to cut right through the quiet. It sounded like a group of people, maybe 3 or 4 voices, laughing at some joke we could not hear. Jenna said it was probably late arrivals setting up camp, people who drove in after dark to get an early start on their weekend. That made sense, and we all relaxed a little, though I remember thinking it was strange we had not heard a car pull up, or doors slamming, or any of the usual noise that comes with people arriving somewhere new. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it started, and the silence that followed was almost worse. Danny turned down his speaker, and we all sat there listening, waiting for more sounds. Voices, tent poles clicking together, a cooler being dragged across gravel. But there was nothing. Just the crackle of our fire and the occasional splash of something moving in the lake behind us. Troy said, maybe they were just passing through, hikers cutting across the campground on their way somewhere else. Nobody really believed that, but nobody wanted to say it out loud either. We tried to get back into the birthday mood, but the energy had shifted. Nathan poured another round of whiskey and made a toast about friendship and getting old, and we all raised our cups and drank. But the conversation kept dying in strange places. Every few minutes someone would pause mid-sentence and tilt their head toward the darkness, listening for something. Around 1 in the morning, Jenna said she was tired and wanted to turn in. She and Nathan shared the biggest tent, the green one closest to the fire pit, while Troy and Danny had a smaller blue tent a few feet away. I had brought my own single-person tent and set it up slightly apart from the others, near the edge of our site where the ground was flattest. As everyone started moving toward their sleeping bags, I stayed behind to pour water on the fire and make sure it was fully out. That is when I saw the flashlight beam again. It swept across the tree trunks about 50 yards into the woods, moving slowly from left to right, and then it stopped. The light held steady for maybe 10 seconds, pointed in my direction, and I could feel it like a physical weight on my chest. Then it clicked off and the darkness rushed back in. I stood there frozen with the water jug still in my hand, my heart slamming against my ribs, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. I did not tell the others what I saw. Part of me thought I was being paranoid, letting the weird laughter from earlier get into my head. I finished putting out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut behind me with shaking fingers. For a long time I just lay there on top of my sleeping bag, fully clothed, staring at the nylon ceiling and listening. The campground was dead quiet now. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing except the occasional creak of branches settling. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to hushed voices. It was Troy and Danny talking outside their tent in urgent whispers. I checked my phone and saw it was almost 3 in the morning. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and crawled out into the darkness, and Troy immediately grabbed my arm. He pointed toward Site 16 and told me to look. There was a figure standing at the edge of the empty campsite, maybe 40 feet from where we were. I could barely make out the shape in the darkness. A person, definitely a person, standing completely still and facing our direction. No flashlight, no movement, just standing there like they were watching us. Danny was breathing fast beside me, asking what we should do, but none of us had an answer. Troy grabbed a heavy flashlight from his tent and clicked it on, swinging the beam toward Site 16. The figure was gone. Just the empty fire pit and the wooden post with the number on it, and the dark wall of trees beyond. We swept the light back and forth across the tree line, but there was nobody there. No movement. Nothing to prove what we had all just seen. Danny wanted to wake up Nathan and Jenna, but Troy said we should wait. Said maybe it was just some drunk camper from another site wandering around lost. I knew that was not true, and I think Troy knew it too. But saying it out loud made everything feel slightly less insane. We agreed to take shifts staying awake and watching, and I volunteered for the first one. Troy and Danny went back into their tent, but I could hear them whispering for a long time before it finally went quiet. I sat on the picnic table bench with the flashlight in my lap, scanning the darkness every few seconds, my ears straining for any sound. An hour passed with nothing. Then another. By the time the sky started showing the faintest hint of gray on the horizon, I had almost convinced myself the whole thing was some kind of shared hallucination, brought on by too much whiskey and not enough sleep. That is when I heard the footsteps. They came from behind me, from the direction of the lake, soft crunching sounds on the gravel and pine needles that covered the ground near the water. I spun around and raised the flashlight, but the beam only reached so far, dissolving into the mist that had started rising off the lake surface. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath and listened, and in that silence I heard something else. A low chuckle, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the fog. It was the same kind of laughter we had heard earlier, but this time it was just one voice, and it was close, maybe 20 feet away in the darkness. I wanted to yell for the others, but my throat had clamped shut. The chuckling stopped, and then I heard the footsteps again, faster now, moving away from me toward the parking area where we had left the cars. I finally found my voice and shouted for everyone to wake up, and within seconds Nathan came bursting out of his tent, asking what the hell was going on. I pointed toward the parking lot and we all grabbed whatever we could find. Flashlights, a hatchet Nathan had brought for firewood, a heavy metal thermos, and moved together through the darkness toward the cars. The parking area was about 100 yards from our campsite, connected by a narrow gravel path that wound through the trees. We moved in a tight group with Nathan in front and me bringing up the rear, flashlight beams cutting wild patterns through the darkness. Jenna was crying softly, asking over and over what was happening, and none of us had anything to tell her. When we reached the clearing where the cars were parked, Nathan stopped so suddenly that Troy walked right into his back. Our car, the only car since we had all driven up together in my SUV, sat alone in the gravel lot, tilted at a strange angle. Even before we got close enough to see the damage, I knew what had happened. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber hanging in ribbons around the rims. The whole vehicle sunk down onto its axles like a dead animal. Nathan circled the car with his flashlight, counting the cuts, and his voice cracked when he said there were at least 2 deep gashes in each tire. Whoever did this had taken their time. They had been thorough. Danny pulled out his phone to call for help, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. And when the rest of us checked our phones, it was the same story. We were 3 hours from home with no way to drive and no way to call anyone. Troy said we needed to walk to the ranger station near the entrance, that it was only about a mile down the main road, and someone would be there, or at least there would be a landline phone we could use. Nathan agreed, but Jenna refused to move, saying she was not walking through the dark with someone out there watching us. That is when we heard the sound that made everything worse. A tent zipper, the distinctive ripping noise of nylon teeth separating, coming from the direction of our campsite. We had left everything behind when we ran to check the cars, our supplies, our bags, everything. The 5 of us stood paralyzed in the parking lot, listening to the sounds of someone going through our camp. I heard a cooler lid slam shut, something heavy being dragged across the ground. Then that laughter again, louder this time, echoing through the trees like whoever was making it wanted us to hear. Jenna grabbed Nathan's arm and begged him to do something, but what could any of us do? There was one of them that we knew of, maybe more, and they clearly knew this place better than we did. They had been watching us all night waiting, and now they had us exactly where they wanted us. Nathan made the call. We were going to the ranger station, all of us together, and we were going now. He handed the hatchet to Troy and told Danny to grab the biggest rocks he could find. Jenna was still shaking, but she nodded and fell into line between me and Nathan. We started down the main road, moving fast, flashlights pointed straight ahead. The road was paved but narrow, with thick woods pressing in on both sides, and every shadow looked like a person waiting to step out. About halfway to the ranger station, we heard footsteps in the trees to our left, keeping pace with us, crunching through the underbrush maybe 30 feet away. Nobody said anything. We just walked faster, almost running, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps matched our speed. Then they started getting closer. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, and underneath it all that same low chuckling sound, like this was all some kind of game. Danny screamed and hurled one of his rocks into the darkness, and for a moment everything went silent. Then a flashlight clicked on from inside the trees, blinding us with its beam, and a man's voice called out something I could not understand. Words that sounded slurred and wrong, like someone speaking through a mouthful of water. Troy raised the hatchet and shouted that he would kill anyone who came near us, and I believed him. I really did. The flashlight clicked off and we ran. We made it to the ranger station just as the sky was turning pink with dawn. The building was dark, but there was an emergency phone box mounted on the outside wall, and Nathan broke the glass with his elbow and dialed 911. The police arrived within 40 minutes, 2 county sheriff vehicles with lights flashing, and we told them everything while sitting on the tailgate of a patrol car wrapped in shock blankets. They searched the campground and found our site completely trashed. Tents collapsed and torn, coolers emptied, clothes scattered everywhere. They found footprints all around our camp, boot prints that did not match any of our shoes, and more prints leading into the woods toward an old service road that was not on any public map. A deputy told us they had received similar reports before, that there was a man who lived rough in these woods, a drifter with a history of mental illness who had been spotted near the campground several times over the past few years, but always disappeared before anyone could catch him. They never found him that morning either. We gave our statements and a tow truck came for my ruined car, and Nathan's dad drove 3 hours to pick us all up. None of us talked much on the ride home. Jenna broke up with Nathan a few weeks later, said she could not look at him without thinking about that night. Troy still refuses to go camping anywhere. And me, I still think about that man in the woods sometimes. Still wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in our tents, if we had not heard those footsteps moving toward the parking lot. The police said he probably just wanted to scare us, that drifters like him usually do not actually hurt anyone. But I remember that laughter, the way it sounded like he was enjoying himself, like we were the most fun he had in years. And I remember those slashed tires, the careful, deliberate cuts, and I know that whoever he was scaring us was not the only thing on his mind that night. I'd been looking forward to that camping weekend for weeks, mostly because life had been so loud lately that I needed a place where my phone couldn't buzz every 3 minutes. Back then, I was juggling a messy work schedule and crashing on a friend's couch while looking for a new apartment. So when my friend Lana suggested a quick escape to a lakeside campground a few hours from town, I jumped at it without thinking twice. It was me, Lana, her cousin Ivy, and our friend Paige. 4 of us crammed into Lana's aging SUV with way too many snacks and a playlist that barely held us together. We reached the site in the late afternoon, the kind of place where pine needles blanket everything and the lake sits so still it looks like it's holding its breath. Setting up camp felt almost therapeutic, staking the tents, dragging logs into a crude bench around the fire pit, and arguing over who was worst at tying knots. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could actually stretch my mind out and relax. The night eased in slowly, that bluish hour when the trees turn into silhouettes and conversations start to loosen. We made dinner on a small grill Lana insisted on bringing, even though it looked like it belonged in a museum. And after a while, someone pulled out a bag of marshmallows and we all started telling stories that got dumber and more chaotic with each drink. The fire crackled loud enough to make the surrounding woods feel farther away, like we were in our own bubble. At one point, Ivy tried to teach us a ridiculous campfire song she remembered from a childhood summer program, something involving hand motions none of us could replicate after 2 beers. We were loud, laughing, comfortable. Everything felt uncomplicated in the best way. Must have been close to midnight when Paige stopped mid-sentence and tilted her head toward the hill above our site. A narrow dirt road ran up there, empty as far as we knew, blocked from our campsite by a row of tall pines. But through the branches we caught the shape of a pickup truck parked on the road. No headlights, no movement, just the faint growl of an engine running low. At first we didn't quite register it. The fire was bright and our conversations were louder than our instincts. But the longer we looked, the stranger it felt that anyone would be up there, engine humming in the dark, without even a cabin light turning on. Lana muttered that maybe someone was just on the phone or taking a break. Paige joked that it was probably some guy who got lost trying to find a place to pee. None of us wanted to be the one to say the situation made us tense. Eventually the truck rolled away, slow enough that we heard gravel shift, and the mood drifted back to normal. We pretended we weren't still thinking about it as we put out the fire and shuffled into our tents. I shared a tent with Lana, and we lay there talking quietly until the conversation thinned and sleep started pulling us under. Sometime deep in the night, I snapped awake to the sound of footsteps, measured steps heavy enough to compress the soil but soft enough that whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. I held my breath, listening as those steps moved between the tents, one pass then another, followed by a faint clink near the fire pit. Lana whispered something I couldn't make out, and for a long moment we just lay there, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to continue. But eventually the night fell silent again, and neither of us dared unzip the tent to check. By the time pale light began filtering through the tent fabric, my nerves felt stretched thin from a night of half-sleep. The others emerged around the same time, each of us pretending we'd rested fine until Ivy admitted that she'd heard someone brushing past her tent sometime before dawn. Paige said she thought she heard low breathing outside her door flap, but convinced herself it was the wind because the alternative made no sense in a place so remote. None of us wanted to bring up the truck again, but the memory of its silent shape hovering on the ridge stuck with us like a burr you can't shake off. We gathered around what was left of the fire pit as the sky shifted from gray to gold, trying to act like people who'd simply had an ordinary night outdoors. Lana walked toward the cooler to start breakfast, only to stop abruptly and call us over. The lid hung open and most of the food we'd packed was gone, not dragged out or torn apart by animals, just removed, neatly, intentionally. Some wrappers were stacked to the side like someone had gone through everything with a purpose. Our campsite didn't show any signs of wildlife poking around. No claw marks, no scattered trash. No tracks that looked like anything but boot prints. The kind you don't expect to see when you know the only shoes among your group belong to 4 women wearing sneakers with very different soles. Ivy pointed out a set of prints circling the fire area, deep and crisp, as if made only a couple of hours earlier when the ground was still damp. That realization sent a shiver through our group. Not panic exactly, but an unsettling awareness that someone had been studying our space while we slept. Paige backed away from the fire pit and moved toward her tent, saying she wanted to grab her phone to check the time. Then she stopped at the doorway, staring at the roof of the tent like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Resting right in the center was a set of car keys. Not ours. Not from Lana's SUV. The key fob was old, scratched, attached to a small metal tag with numbers etched faintly into it. None of us recognized the brand stamped on the back. Paige didn't even want to touch them at first. She used the corner of her sleeve to lift them, turning them in her hand like some kind of warning had been left for us. That was when the memory of the footsteps clicked into place and made the whole scene feel heavier. Someone had walked between our tents, rummaged through our cooler, circled our fire, and left keys deliberately where they'd be seen. Lana's voice shook a little when she suggested maybe the keys belonged to someone who stopped by during the night for help. But if that were true, why not say something? Why not call out, and why take our food? We all kept scanning the tree line and the ridge above, half expecting to see that same truck watching us again. The woods around us felt unusually still, almost like the morning was waiting for us to decide our next move. Lana was the first to suggest packing up, and none of us argued. We moved quickly, not talking much, just collecting our things in a rhythm that bordered on frantic. Every few minutes, one of us would glance at the dirt road above the hill, expecting that truck to appear again. The morning air carried a calm that didn't match the atmosphere inside our circle. Even the birds felt quiet, like they were keeping their distance. I remember stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack with far more force than necessary, wanting nothing more than solid walls and a locked door. It didn't help that the boot prints around the campsite seemed clearer in the early light, as if the person who left them had lingered longer than we first thought. Once everything was in the car, Paige insisted we walk the perimeter one more time to be sure we hadn't missed anything important. I didn't want to, but leaving without checking felt worse. We followed her in tense silence as she traced the line of disturbed soil leading from the cooler area toward the trees. There were more prints than we had realized, some overlapping, some angled like the person had paused to look back at our tents. A broken twig here, a faint scuff on a rock there. At one point, Ivy crouched to examine a mark on the ground that looked like someone had knelt beside the fire pit. Maybe that same moment we heard the faint clink during the night. We didn't find any other belongings or clues, just the sense that whoever visited us had moved with intention. The drive back felt longer than the trip in. None of us talked much. We were too busy replaying that night from every possible angle, trying to justify the things that didn't make sense. Lana kept glancing in the rearview mirror, and every time her eyes flicked up, my pulse ticked a little faster. When we reached the main road, Paige pulled the unfamiliar keys from her pocket and set them in the cup holder between us. None of us wanted to bring them home, but tossing them in the woods felt wrong too, like ignoring something we should take seriously. Eventually, we agreed to leave them at a ranger station on the way back to town. The ranger who greeted us took one look at the keys and asked if we'd found them near the old logging trails. We hadn't mentioned anything about trails. When we told him which campsite we'd used, he let out a slow breath and said they'd had scattered reports over the years of a man who drove an older pickup through the back roads, watching campsites from a distance. No violence, just strange behavior, early morning tire tracks, missing food, objects moved around, little things left behind. No one had ever caught him, or even gotten a description clear enough to help. According to the ranger, the keys didn't match any recent lost item reports. He promised to log them anyway, and told us we'd done the right thing leaving. That was the final push we needed. We went straight home and never camped in that area again. I still think about those footsteps in the dark and the quiet way that stranger moved around us, and I'm grateful every day that he left before any of us woke up fully. Camping at Pine Hollow State Park with my younger sister, Emily, was supposed to be a break from the noise of our everyday lives. I had just switched jobs, and she had taken a few days off from her internship, so disappearing into the woods felt like the right move at the time. We picked a small, isolated campground near a lake, the kind of spot where you can hear water brushing against the shore if everything else stays quiet. The evening felt peaceful enough, soft breeze, fire crackling, the smell of pine settling around us. Nothing that hinted anything strange was coming. We talked about work, about our parents, about how we both missed summer trips we used to take as kids. By the time we zipped up the tent for the night, it felt like life had slowed down just enough to breathe. Somewhere deep into the night, I woke up without knowing why. It wasn't cold, and there wasn't any obvious noise at first, just the usual nighttime sounds. Branches shifting, insects humming. Emily was asleep next to me, curled inside her sleeping bag. I was about to lie back down when a faint whisper crept through the fabric of the tent. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't some animal moving around. It was a voice, low, quiet, dragging the syllables like someone trying not to be heard. And it said my name, not shouted, not spoken normally. More like someone right outside our tent trying to get my attention without waking anyone else in the world. I thought I imagined it. I held my breath, listening, trying to figure out whether it was coming from the lake or the trees behind us. Then it said Emily's name, in that same breathy, drawn-out way. My sister stirred a little, like she was dreaming, but she didn't wake up. I leaned closer to the tent wall, trying to see if someone's shadow would show through the fabric, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that whisper slipping between the trees, repeating our names like whoever it was knew exactly who we were. I told myself some campers nearby must have overheard us earlier and were messing around. It was the only explanation that didn't make me want to unzip the tent and run. In the morning, we walked the whole campground expecting to find a group of teenagers laughing about their brilliant prank. But every site was empty, not just empty, untouched. Picnic tables with a thin layer of pollen, charcoal grills without a single ember, fire rings that hadn't been disturbed in days. When we reached the small trail office by the entrance, the ranger checking his inventory told us we were the only people who had checked in the night before. His tone was casual, but he gave us a look like he was waiting for us to mention something. When I finally asked if he'd heard anything strange during the night, he paused just long enough to make my chest tighten, then said, "Visitors sometimes report voices in the woods, calling them by name, and that it usually happens right before someone vanishes on one of the trails." We tried to laugh it off as we walked back to our campsite, but the ranger's comment hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Emily kept glancing toward the tree line, the way you do when you feel like someone might step out at any second. I kept trying to think logically. Maybe the ranger was just trying to scare us into staying on marked trails. Maybe he exaggerated the stories. Maybe the whispers were just the wind shaping itself strangely through the branches. But none of those explanations lined up with the fact that the voice had used our names, spoken clearly enough that I recognized the exact tone. As we cleaned up the campsite and decided to take a short hike anyway, I kept replaying that whisper in my head, trying to convince myself it wasn't as clear as I remembered. The trail we picked was quiet in a way that didn't match the early afternoon light. Birds weren't making much noise, and even the leaves overhead seemed still, as if the whole forest was waiting for something. Emily walked ahead of me, pointing out weirdly bent trees or tracks in the dirt, trying to distract us. But neither of us could completely shake the tension crawling between us. At one point, we reached a fork in the path, and a wooden sign pointed left toward the overlook. I suggested going that way, but Emily hesitated. staring into the cluster of trees on the right trail as if something there had pulled her attention. When I asked what she saw, she said she thought she heard someone whispering again, this time farther away, like a distant voice threading through the undergrowth. We stood there for a minute, listening, but the woods were silent. I told her it was probably just her nerves reacting to the ranger's story, and she nodded, though she didn't look convinced. We kept going toward the overlook, and for a while things felt normal again. The air smelled like sun-warmed pine, and the trail opened up just enough for light to spill through. But as we got closer to the viewpoint, something shifted around us. Not a noise, not a movement, more like the forest had gone quiet in a way that felt intentional. Emily slowed until she was right beside me, and I noticed the tiny hairs on her arms standing straight up. She whispered my name, not to get my attention, but to ask a question without saying the whole sentence out loud. Did I hear it too? At first, I thought she meant footsteps or branches moving, but then the same low whisper from the night before drifted toward us from the trees off the trail. Only this time, it didn't sound like it was calling from outside a tent. It sounded like it was standing somewhere between the trunks, as if someone was hiding just out of sight. It said my name once, then hers, letting each syllable drag through the quiet afternoon. Emily's grip tightened on my arm, and every instinct in me pushed to get her away from that stretch of forest. We stepped backward, slow at first, then quicker, not turning our backs to the trees until we reached the fork again. Whatever was in those woods knew who we were. And it didn't sound confused or lost. It sounded like it wanted us to follow. Back at the campsite, we didn't even sit down. We threw everything into the trunk of my car with the kind of coordination that comes from shared panic, neither of us needing to say much. The woods around us felt different from the night before, brighter but somehow heavier, as if the sunlight was just a thin layer stretched over something waiting underneath. I kept expecting to hear that whisper thread between the trees again. Emily kept glancing toward the narrow path that led down to the lake, as though someone might walk up from the shoreline at any second. We weren't talking anymore. Every few seconds, one of us would pause and listen, trying to catch any sound that didn't belong. Even the breeze pushing through the pines seemed too quiet. Once we were in the car, the relief was short-lived. The road leading out of the campground cut through a long stretch of dense woods, and the trees leaned close on both sides like they wanted to hide whatever moved beneath them. I focused on the dirt road ahead, but Emily suddenly said my name in a timid, wavering voice I hadn't heard from her since we were kids. She pointed to her phone. She had no signal, but the lock screen kept turning on by itself, displaying a dark, blurry image, as if the phone had snapped a photo from inside her pocket. The picture showed nothing obvious, but the background looked too much like the trail we'd taken earlier. She swore she hadn't touched the camera. I didn't know what to tell her. All I knew was that we had to get out of those woods fast. When we reached the ranger station again, the same man from earlier stepped outside before we even parked, like he already sensed we were coming back. I told him, without much detail, that we'd heard something again on the trail and didn't feel safe staying. He studied us for a moment, then said quietly that people who hear their names in the forest usually describe the same thing, a voice that seems close but never shows itself. Some say it sounds like a family member. Others say it mimics the exact tone of someone they know. And according to him, every missing person case in the park started with that same detail. He advised us to go straight home and not linger anywhere alone between the trees. The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. We drove the entire way back to town without music, without stopping, barely speaking. Emily kept her phone in her lap, screen facing down, like she didn't trust whatever had caused it to light up. I kept replaying everything. The whisper outside the tent, the empty campsites, the voice on the trail, the ranger's warning. That night, neither of us slept well, and for weeks afterward, I'd hear faint noises whenever I passed wooded areas, even small patches of trees near the highway. Nothing ever called my name again, but the memory of how it sounded hasn't faded. I don't know what would have happened if we had followed the voice deeper into the forest. I'm just grateful we left when we did. Mornings at that campsite felt like a break from everything I'd been dealing with at home, and that was the whole reason I'd gone out there with my dog, Milo. I was 16, stubborn, and convinced that a few quiet days in the woods would clear my head before school started again. Milo was the kind of dog people remembered. A reddish mutt with mismatched eyes and a strange habit of tilting his head like he understood full sentences. We'd been on that trail before, but this time the place felt heavier, like the air carried some kind of tension I couldn't pin down. I kept telling myself it was just because the campground was quieter than usual, with only one other spot occupied way down near the stream. I spent most of that day wandering around the area, letting Milo sprint ahead and catch scents, while I tried to settle into the idea of having actual peace for a bit. By late afternoon, the weather had shifted in a way that made the woods seem older, almost watchful. Milo kept pausing, staring toward the thick line of trees behind our tent with his ears pinned forward. Normally he was fearless, the type to chase after any sound without hesitation, but he kept circling close to me like he wasn't sure about something. I tried to laugh it off and tossed him a treat, thinking maybe he was just tired from the hike earlier. The campsite itself had this odd layout: tall pines on three sides and an uphill slope behind us where the ground dipped into a shadowy ravine. Every time the wind passed through that direction, the branches scraped in a way that reminded me of someone dragging cloth over bark. I kept pretending not to notice how often I looked back at it. Everything shifted around dusk, right when I was finishing dinner over the fire. Milo perked up suddenly, tail low, nose twitching as he stared again toward the ravine. Before I could say anything, he let out this soft, uneasy whine, one I'd only heard once before, the night he cut his paw on broken glass and tried to hide it from me. Then he trotted toward the tree line, glancing back as if expecting me to follow. I called after him, telling him not to go far, but he slipped between the trees anyway. His footsteps faded fast, swallowed up by the thick layers of pine needles and underbrush. A minute passed, then two. Then the forest went still in a way that didn't feel normal for that time of day. When I finally called his name, the answer I got made my whole body react in a way I don't have a perfect word for. It was a whine, the same pitch Milo made when he wanted attention, but it echoed deeper in the woods, stretched slightly wrong, like someone trying to imitate him without understanding how real dogs breathe between sounds. The moment I heard it, I knew it wasn't him. Milo's real whine always had a tremble at the end, like he couldn't hold the note perfectly. This one cut off too clean, almost clipped, like whoever or whatever made it didn't know how to finish the sound naturally. I stood there, staring into the dark patch of trees where the response had come from, feeling this rising certainty that I shouldn't step closer to it, no matter what. I kept calling for Milo, but the woods stayed quiet except for that one strange response I couldn't get out of my head. It replayed in my mind over and over, the too clean ending, the way it seemed to come from farther away than Milo could have run in that short time. I waved my flashlight toward the trees, the beam catching on uneven patches of branches that looked like they'd been disturbed recently. Normally, Milo would have barked back or come sprinting toward the light, crashing through bushes without a care. But there was nothing. The longer I stood there, the more I noticed how the forest around me felt wrong for early evening. No insects buzzing, no rustling, no distant birds settling down. Just this thick silence that seemed to press against my ears. I kept telling myself he'd show up any second, but the part of me that knew Milo best kept saying something had lured him farther than he meant to go. Eventually, I grabbed the small camping lantern and stepped toward the edge of the ravine, stopping right before the slope dipped down. The ground there looked churned up in a weird way, as if someone had stepped repeatedly in the same spots, trying to flatten the grass. I crouched down, shining the light over the area, and spotted a few impressions that were definitely not from Milo. They were too long, too narrow, almost like footprints from someone walking carefully on the very edges of their feet. The spacing between them was strange too, like whoever made them had an awkward gait or was deliberately trying to mask their stride. The moment I noticed that, the wind shifted again from the ravine. carrying with it a faint smell that reminded me of wet rope and metal left out in the rain. It wasn't a scent I'd ever associated with animals out here. Panic started creeping up on me, but I forced myself to think rationally and headed back to the campsite. I kept the lantern high, scanning everything: the tent, the cooler, the scattered gear near the fire pit. Nothing looked disturbed, but the whole spot felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like someone else had been circling it while I wasn't paying attention. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been, stretching toward the tent in thin, crooked shapes that didn't match the trees behind them. I reached into the tent for my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen stayed stubbornly blank. That isolation hit me harder than I expected. I stood there with my hand on Milo's empty leash, realizing I didn't even know which direction to start searching without risking getting lost myself. My instincts kept telling me to stay put until sunrise, but every few minutes I'd hear something subtle, a faint crack, a soft shift of leaves, coming from the same area Milo had run toward. Not close, but not far enough to ignore. It almost felt like someone was matching my movements from a distance, stepping only when I stepped, pausing only when I paused. At one point, I heard that imitation whine again, but this time it sounded quieter, like whoever made it was trying to lure me slowly instead of calling me directly. I stood perfectly still, gripping the lantern so hard the handle dug into my palm, listening to the echo fade into the trees. There was no way Milo would have responded like that. Whoever was out there had been practicing his sounds, waiting for the right moment. At some point in the night, exhaustion won over fear, and I ended up sitting with my back against a tree, trying to stay alert while fighting off the heaviness in my eyes. The lantern burned low, giving everything around me this washed-out pale look, like the world had been drained of color. Every so often I whispered Milo's name, quietly enough that if someone was listening, it wouldn't give away my position too clearly. The forest answered with nothing but that same thick quiet, and it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. When the lantern finally dimmed to its weakest glow, I noticed movement near the slope. Not a full shape, just a shift in the darkness, like someone stepping back the moment the light tried to catch them. That single moment convinced me I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there long before Milo wandered off. The hours before dawn stretched endlessly, and I kept replaying every sound I'd heard the day before. Milo sniffing around the trees, the branches scraping, the echoing fake whine. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the thing, or person, had been circling us for more than just that evening. Around early morning, I heard a distant engine turning over near the trailhead. It was old, the kind of engine that rattles before settling, and it kicked on as if someone had been waiting for the exact moment sunlight started touching the trees. No voices, no doors slamming, no footsteps rushing away, just the engine humming steadily for a few seconds before fading down the dirt road. I stayed frozen where I sat, listening until the sound was completely gone. When it finally stopped, the forest seemed to loosen its grip on the silence. Once the sun pushed fully through the treetops, I grabbed my pack and headed toward the trailhead, calling for Milo in short bursts. My voice bounced strangely between the trees, like the forest hadn't quite woken up yet. I didn't get far before I spotted him, lying just a few yards off the path, half hidden behind a cluster of ferns. His fur was ruffled, and he had a shallow cut near his shoulder, like he'd brushed against something sharp or been grabbed roughly. He lifted his head when he saw me, tail thumping weakly against the ground, and the relief that hit me nearly knocked the breath out of my chest. I wrapped my arms around him, checking him carefully. His injuries weren't deep, but he looked shaken in a way I'd never seen before. He kept glancing past me toward the woods, as if expecting something to step out. I carried him back to the trailhead as fast as I could, and that's when I noticed something I'd missed earlier. Tire tracks that didn't belong to any ranger vehicle. They were fresh, narrow, and uneven, like the vehicle had been loaded unevenly, or someone inside kept shifting weight. The tracks led away from the campground, the same direction the engine sound had gone. I didn't stick around to investigate. I just got Milo into the car and drove straight home. Even now, thinking back on it, I'm convinced someone had been watching the campsite for days, waiting for a chance to separate us. Whoever it was knew how to imitate Milo just well enough to lure him off, but not well enough to hide the mistake in the sound. That tiny flaw might have been the only thing that stopped me from walking into the trees that night.